lively discussion by the crowd here. So my name is Lisa Chow, and on behalf of their team at Maison Française and my NYU colleagues, I welcome you this evening for Terrible Truths, Confronting History and Memory. This is just one event of the Literary Mews, a series of free events at NYU, part of the Penn World Voices Festival, which runs all week, as I'm sure you know. Other events being held at NYU are listed on the poster in our lobby. So the Literary Mews is an annual collaboration between Penn and a number of our cultural houses at NYU. Casa Italiana, Deutsches Haus, Institute of African American Affairs, and Center for Black Visual Culture, the Creative Writing Program, and the Maison Française. We've had a lot of dialogue leading up to this event, and what you see is the result, which is an intersection of our different communities. The Penn World Voices Festival brings together more than 200 writers and artists representing over 50 nationalities. This year's theme is Open Secrets. In over 70 events in venues across New York City, the 15th anniversary of New York's first International Literary Festival gathers writers, thinkers, and artists. Thank you to Penn for years of collaboration with NYU and to the Penn staff and volunteers here. And thank you to all my core organizers for making this event possible. So tonight, Baer will be moderating the event. He's a university professor at New York University and has published extensively on the representation of personal and collective trauma literature, film, photography, and public debate. Among his books are Remnants of Song, The Experience of Modernity in Charles Baudelaire and Paul Celan, and Spectral Evidence, The Photography of Trauma. His podcast, Think About It, is devoted to in-depth conversations and powerful ideas, including freedom of speech and transformative books. His new work, What Snowflakes Get Right, Free Speech, Equality, and Truth in the University, will be published by Oxford University Press in summer 2019.
Thank you very much. Good evening, thank you. Thank you, Maison Française, and my colleagues at NYU. Thank you so very much for being here tonight, and I want to thank the panelists. I'll be very brief in introducing them because we really want to get to a conversation. This event is called Terrible Truth, and it's an odd thing to welcome you to Terrible Truth. So I wanted to open up with two citations from two poets to give us a sense of direction, the way poetry can do, and to orient us in the way language can be used to orient or disorient us. So the first quote is from Paul Celan, the German language poet who survived the Holocaust and then wrote poetry after the war from 1945 roughly till 1970 in German, the language of the perpetrators, the Germans who murdered his parents. So Celan used the language of German to testify to those who couldn't speak any longer, to those who died or those who survived. And he wrote a line in 1961 that says, "Nobody bears witness for the witness." Nobody bears witness for the witness. There are two things in that line, it could use a little more explanation, that the position of the witness is solitary. That there's only one person who bears witness unless somebody else takes up the task and hears the call and heeds the call to respond and create something. The second quote is the poet Audre Lorde, the African-American poet who wrote in the 1980s, and the quote, familiar to many of you, is called, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And what Lorde wanted to say is you cannot use the tools of oppression to undo oppression. She also said, as an African-American lesbian poet, you cannot use English so easily when English is used to oppress so many people. But she also added, the people who are worried about that sentence are the people who remain committed to thinking the master will provide the solution to our problems. So Audre Lorde said, at the moment when language is so difficult because language has been taken from us and used to tell stories against us, we also have to be creative to take language back and shape something. Our four panelists are operating in different languages, and as you can see, also translating. We have someone here who happily speaks several languages, as many of us do, so we have a translator, so please bear with us for a translator on the panel, thank you, who is transmitting, unless we want to do the whole thing in Italian, which is completely fine, or in French, so just bear with us. There's a little echo in the middle. language, that's what we're talking about today, that actually every language contains difference, and that difference can be activated as potential for resistance. Daniel Blaufuks is here on my left. He's going to start out. He's a filmmaker, a writer who's edited and written many books and made movies that have been screened at NYU and many other institutions. Filloux is right next to him, who's a playwright who's been writing about human rights and social justice for over 25 years, has a web production in production right now that's not properly in play, that will be live streamed on Monday. She'll tell you about it afterwards. Tanisha Ford is also a writer whose book, Dressed in Dreams, A Black Girl's Love Letter to the Power of Fashion, is coming out in about a month or so, correct? Right? So Tanisha is also from New York, so she's going to join us. And then Domenico Starnone, who is a writer whose 3 books into English, 2 have been translated by Joe Balaguer, are called First Execution, Ties, and Trick. And Domenico will be speaking in Italian, will translate, but I do encourage you to tolerate and embrace that difference that exists in languages. So we'll have several languages in the panel. I speak with an authentic New York accent, as you can hear. I'm very pleased, and we will go in this order. Everybody, all the writers, will say a little bit about what their work is about, read a little bit. I've kind of tried to use my German side and say I'm going to impose some discipline, so they'll all move on. And then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll have you participate. We want this to be an evening, actually, of communication and dialogue, so they're all happy and looking forward to your questions. Thank you. So you're going to start.
Right. Shall I speak in Portuguese then? Thank you. Well, as Ulrich said, I'm a Portuguese, German, Jewish artist coming from Lisbon. My grandparents were German Jewish refugees on one side and Polish Jewish refugees on the other side. So it's thanks to Hitler that I was born in Lisbon and born at all. I work mainly with photography and film, so I would be what one calls a visual artist. But I do write a lot, and most of my books are with text and images. Main subject, and I think also that's the reason for me. Sorry.
Thank you.
Is it better now? Or is it even connected? Okay. I'm not sure it's connected.
Oh, it is connected.
It is connected? Okay, sorry.
Turn it up.
Okay, I'm going to speak louder. So my work dwells a lot around, obviously around memory, and I focus often on what happened during the Second World War. Not only, obviously, the Holocaust and the Shoah. I'm mostly interested, I don't think it's ever going to happen again as it happened, but the mechanism that made it happen is still working, and it's still functioning in many countries, as you can see from recent examples all over the world. So I'm interested in studying and visualizing mostly these kind of mechanisms that lead us astray and ultimately bring us to fascism. Anyhow, as I have not brought visual work to show you, I'm going to read a text that I wrote on the territory of memory that I think it focused, I hope it focused on a bit of the idea of this panel. The archive is unexpectedly not what we remember, but what we have forgotten, or at least partly forgotten. That is exactly why we need the archive, to restore memory, to clarify memory, to extract memory from recordings, from artifacts, from journals and newspapers. However, we should also consider that the archive is not necessarily a physical place or a collection of documents and objects stored at an exact address. In fact, we are born into archive, in which we first have to understand what is being given. We are all born into an already existing world, and we are awaited, as Benjamin once wrote. It is we who create memory, or, on the contrary, is it memory that creates us? Life is nothing but a transmission of an ongoing archive, as you use the objects of the past while creating the objects of the future. A city is obviously an archive full of bones, stones, and names bearing history from before our time. A language is an archive, in as much as a book is, and acquiring a foreign language is also acquiring access to other archives. A house is an archive, full of more or less untold stories and undiscovered connections. Every photograph or any film is, as time passes, a growing archive. Each person contains an archive within, carrying more and more valuable information, experience, images, and collecting objects as mementos, objects that will lose any significant value when there is no more memory attached to them. We know that all these archives will pass away, and therefore I, rush to film, photograph, record the people and places of the past, at times saving their objects in order to expand the lifetime of a particular memory. For that, we create the physical archive, the building, the museum that will contain the memory that should not be forgotten, despite the given fact that it is already detached from the normal flow of time. In this archive, the objects and the documents will be sanctified, losing their original function and purpose, so that they should only be handled with extreme care by responsible archivists, scholars, and academics, who will religiously try to preserve the inherent wisdom of these artifacts as lessons for a future yet to arrive. I have not forgotten that my grandfather, Herbert August, once told me what he thought was the difference between a Jewish and a non-Jewish child, being mainly that the Jewish kid gets all these questions, even the most idiotic, seriously answered. That alone might be the key of success for a great culture. We should keep it that way and must continue, as adults, to ask questions and further questions. Some questions might not even have answers, but they must be nevertheless asked. And some answers haven't found their questions yet. I think that is what I try to keep doing in my work, and that is, in the end, what defines me as a European Jewish artist. Thank you.
How is this microphone?
No.
Oh, it's not on.
Was this on?
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. As was said, I'm a playwright who's been writing about human rights and social justice for 25 years. I wanted to start by reading from a man who I deeply admire, Brian Stevenson. He recently created the Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, which is a museum and memorial. And he says, our nation's history of racial injustice casts a shadow across the American landscape. This shadow cannot be lifted until we shine the light of truth on the destructive violence that shaped our nation, traumatized people of color, and compromised our commitment to the rule of law and equal justice. One of my plays is called Selma 65, and it is a one-woman show about a woman called Viola Muso, who was a white civil rights worker, mother of 5, who went to the Selma voting march and was gunned down there by the Ku Klux Klan. In the car was an FBI informant, and so in this play, one woman, white woman actress plays Viola Muso and Tommy Rowe, the FBI informant. I'm going to start by reading from the prologue of the play. Viola is beside a tree, wearing a 1960s style cat glasses and talking directly to the audience. She smokes a cigarette. Viola, I am always walking past this tree. I'm barefoot, holding my father's hand. He only has one. He lost his hand in the coal mines. I love that hand of his, cracked and soft at the same time. He tugs mine suddenly. She sees something. Darkness, the lights go out. I don't know where I am. My heart leaves my body. No, I want to look. Wait, I can't see. What was that in the tree, Daddy? Why? I don't understand. I want to see. I always wanted to see, just that kind of person. But the mind is like a clean piece of paper, and certain things, they're like ink on a press, they leave their mark. The mind is innocent until it's not. Memory's written like a dark, black message. There are things I need to erase. What I did to Leroy. This road in the Lowndes Swamp is lined with trees. As I'm driving, the nightmare of the first tree seems to go on forever. I see an explosion of trees. Tree, 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 tree. She finds a rock. My daddy was a coal miner. He knew rocks that light themselves on fire. Make a trail of rocks if you get lost, my daddy told me. Make a trail of rocks if you get lost. Coal. She sets down the coal and finds another rock, holding it up to the light. Have you ever seen smoke trapped in a rock? Smoky quartz from the Lowndes Swamp earth. She sets down the quartz, trying to make a trail of rocks. I'm lost in limbo. That March was the most beautiful day of my life. And I'll just read a little bit later. We see her in the afterlife. And she says, housewives take trips to my grave to kick the tombstone. We hear a voiceover of some of the housewives. I'm here because I wanted to see the tomb of a woman who abandons her children and husband for the right to vote. Demonstrations are nothing but publicity and the urge to get in with the mob. And that voiceover continues, and just so you know, that is from a 1965 Ladies' Home Journal article where women were interviewed, speaking about Viola Musso. She goes on, dead people can't vote. Why would anyone make up that story? Who needs an ID to vote? In Georgia, I saw a black man hanging from a tree. I was a little girl holding my father's hand. We were walking past the tree and my father tugged. His hand was cracked and soft, comforting. My heart left my body. What happened, Daddy? No, I want to look. Wait, I can't see. What's in the tree? I saw the man hanging. People circled around. My daddy told me the man had talked to a white woman. What was wrong with that, I asked. My daddy didn't answer, serious. I walked past that tree. I thought about him, that man, his last moments, what happened to his body. He had a family, probably a daughter just like me. I put Leroy's life in jeopardy driving with him in Lowndes, but he survived. He was all bloody from my blood, but he laid his head on the lap of my dead body and pretended to be dead until they drove off. He got out of the car, ran down the road, and got away. Then they actually accused him over and over of having sex with me. He was 18 years old. I was just another white woman who put a black man in jeopardy. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Tanisha Ford, and I'm a historian by training. In fact, I'm a professor of history at the University of Delaware. But recently, I've been delving into the world of creative nonfiction as a way to take the very complex archival work I do about Black women's stories and memory and the violence of the archive and translate that into creative nonfiction for a broad audience. And so tonight I want to read a bit of a chapter from my forthcoming book, Dressed in Dreams, a Black Girl's Love Letter to the Power of Fashion. And it's in this chapter that I try to push back and write against the very dominant narrative about the war on drugs, and centering a Black girl's experience with that so-called war on drugs and the way that Black people were stigmatized as crack addicts in that time period. This is my first time sharing some of this work, so bear with me if I get just a little bit emotional. Crack hit my family hard. My Aunt Marlene, who was my father's sister and my mother's best friend, got caught up in that first wave of users. No one had seen the short or long-term effects of this new street drug. I remember being at home one day in the winter. This would have been in the late 80s, and it was cold. We were preparing for the holidays and saw the bad weather coming on the forecast, so we were sticking close to home. Dad had started a fire in our fireplace, and I was sitting right next to it, playing with my Barbie dolls as the heat washed over me. The loud rotary phone on the wall rang, and Dad eased off of the floral printed black couch to answer it. Always a cool character, my father, so when my ears caught his voice reaching higher registers, my attention snapped towards him. It sounded as if the person on the phone was relaying the most absurd news ever. I knew this was serious. My parents were conferring now, hushed tones. I couldn't make out the words. The adults were masters at keeping things from us children. I strained my ears trying to make sense of their words. I couldn't. But I could catch it when one of their voices would spike near almost a yell before quieting back down into the hushed whispers whose secrets got trapped inside the walls. Then Dad opened the door and headed out in the freezing winter night. He returned with his sister's 3 children, my favorite cousins, in tow. And now with us kids huddled in my bedroom, I got the story. Mama on drugs, one cousin said. It's called crack. Crack. Apparently my aunt was so hooked on this cheap new drug with a quick high that she was giving away everything she could to get it. My cousins were home alone when their front door was suddenly yanked off its hinges. The landlord, fed up after months and months of my aunt failing to pay rent on the gloomy 2-story house, let the winter in, leaving my cousins home alone in that dead cold. They called my dad, really the only dad they knew, to help them figure out what to do. And it's lucky I like my cousins, because we all got to spend a lot of time together after that. I love my Aunt Marlene too. She was creative and full of spark. She had been accepted into a college art program, but she couldn't pass the gym class needed to get her high school diploma. Like a lot of black folk, her fear of swimming was too great. And just like that, a few laps in a pool had changed her life. Aunt Marlene was too much of a carefree spirit to be chained to a machine in an overheated factory, and Fort Wayne, Indiana didn't really have much else to offer. Crack became her out, I guess. I remember that night so vividly, the first time I really saw the cold wind howling into the fissures of our family, but the drug became familiar so fast. Every night on television, we'd see commercials like the 1987 Partnership for a Drug-Free America Hot Skillet campaign. In 30 seconds, the ad campaign hoped to help America's youth win the war against drugs. This is drugs, the narrator ominously called out, and then an egg was dropped into the frying pan and it instantly began to bubble and sizzle and burn on the ends. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? We had to laugh. It was one of the most hilarious things we'd seen on television, and it aired constantly. Any questions, we'd say, mocking the narrator's voice, using it as a punchline for jokes we cracked on one another when someone said something stupid. They wanted to scare us straight. The commercial didn't understand how much drug culture was part of our everyday existence. It wasn't like some stranger in a trench coat was coming up to us offering us crack. No, drug culture was everywhere, from the music we listened to the shoes we gave drug names. Check out my new cocaine white dope mans. To the family members who once loved us, but now love the pipe a bit more. Drugs were pernicious in a way that the commercial just didn't get. If someone was handing you a crack pipe, chances were it was a family member or a close friend. It wasn't no shadowy figure trying to fry our brains. People were trying to deal with all kinds of pain and fear and disassociation through the higher drugs and the real economic power of the guns and money, and that's something that the US government with its jail and wall approach didn't understand. Those anti-drug programs had no idea what was really going on, and it felt like they made little attempt to figure out how to heal our neighborhoods.
Vi ringrazio, sono felice di essere qui. Vi chiedo scusa perché parlo in italiano e non in inglese.
I thank you for being here and I apologize for not speaking English.
Io sono uno scrittore, ho scritto romanzi, saggi, ma sono qui soprattutto perché sono stato un insegnante per una trentina d'anni, ho insegnato italiano e storia, insieme ai miei alunni mi sono occupato di storia orale nel piccolo centro dove lavoravo.
Forse è meglio. plays as well as novels. I've been teaching for 30 years, and the subjects I thought were Italian and history. And with the students of the little town in which I was working, I dealt with oral history.
Questo piccolo centro era nato all'inizio del Novecento intorno a una fabbrica di esplosivi. Noi ne abbiamo seguito la storia attraverso le testimonianze dall'inizio del secolo scorso fino al secondo dopoguerra, ricostruendo le condizioni di lavoro terribili e soprattutto uno scoppio nella torre del Tritolo che negli anni del 1930 aveva causato
This small town was founded at the beginning of the 20th century around an explosive factory. And so I worked on the history of this little center through actual witnesses, and all the way up until the end of World War II. And we learned about the terrible work conditions in this factory, but also about an explosion that happened in a tower in 1930.
Ho scritto negli anni, a metà anni 90, qualche testo sulla difficoltà di insegnare storia nelle scuole, tema che oggi in Italia è molto discusso. È proprio di questi giorni un appello di scrittori, professori di storia, intellettuali, per considerare la storia un bene comune. L'appello muove dal fatto che il governo italiano, piuttosto che potenziare l'insegnamento della storia nelle scuole, ha ritenuto bene di proporre che la storia sia non considerata più materia d'esame nella conclusione degli studi liceali.
Again, I apologize. I've been dealing also with the difficulties of teaching history in the schools. Currently, in Italy, there is a debate raging about history. And there's been an appeal by some intellectuals, professors of history and writers, because the history has to be considered something that we all have in common. And instead, the Italian government has basically demeaned history because it is no longer part of the subjects that are part of the final exam at the end of high school.
Questo evento legato all'insegnamento della storia si è incrociato negli stessi giorni con la Fiera del Libro di Torino, dove è esploso un evento altrettanto significativo. Un editore legato alla destra estrema, il nome è Casa Pound, e che pubblica una intervista con il ministro degli interni Salvini, è stato fortemente contestato da tutti gli altri editori proprio per la sua connotazione fascista. Il tema del fascismo è un tema centrale all'interno della storia italiana. Io non voglio dilungarmi su questo punto, ma credo che ritornerò su questo tema nel prossimo intervento.
recently, this event has crossed paths with something else in Italy, that is to say with the book fair in Turin, where a publisher that represents an organization, a far-right organization that is called Casa Pound, they represent them, and they've also published an interview book where the current Minister of the Interior, Mr. Salvini, is interviewed. And therefore, their participation to the book fair was objected to by all of the other publishers because they are a fascist publisher. And the theme of fascism is something that is very important in the history of our country, of Italy. I don't want to delve too much on this, but I think it's important.
Invite a little bit of a conversation here. So, you said, any questions? Which was the government's way of saying, this is the story, and you're going to believe it, and this is who you are in that story, right? Any questions? This is a story, and you're going to live in that story. You're going to live in this narrative. And so, everybody has found a way out of a story that you have been put in. So using the archives against themselves, but also saying the archives are critically important. Daniel said the archives are critically important. There are many archives we can enter. Kathleen, you said you had to access something. I'm curious how all of you, Tanisha, how you use the personal to counter the story into which you are placed. And we're all placed into those stories by language, by identity, etc. And the last point here is what Domenico said. We live in a country too with contested stories where a lot of people have a lot of interest to impose a certain narrative on who we are. And it doesn't exclude you. It's actually quite important. It actually puts you into the story in a certain way. So we tend to say, who is in the we? You are in the we, just in a very different way. So I just thought maybe, how do you activate the personal to get out of the story? You said your family story. Any questions means you shouldn't ask any questions, right? So I'd ask you how you can open up having become part of a story that wasn't the story of your own making.
Yes, I mean, and if people read...
Can people hear? Sorry.
Yeah, can you hear? If not, I'll grab the mic.
You gotta feel the mic.
So that I guess they don't have to yell too. It was very important for me to tell this story, and in part because it wasn't that I wanted to sanitize the story, to act like there were never people addicted to crack cocaine and like it didn't happen to my family, but it was a way to take back our own agency and the way we experience that. And it's also in that chapter that I bring to bear the US government, the FBI, the CIA, their involvement in bringing drugs and guns into Black communities and creating a generation of people addicted to crack and then criminalizing us for it, giving harsher sentences to Black and brown people, saying there's gonna be a whole generation of Black kids who were born addicted to crack cocaine, so crack babies. So for me, it was important to tell that story and to tell it how I experienced it and try to piece together the parts of my memory. But to also try to paint a whole picture of my community. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, a factory town, after the factories had, started to collapse in the era of deindustrialization, and to say, like, this is the kind of conditions we saw ourselves in, and this is how the drugs and the gang violence fit into it. And being trained as a historian, there's a way that we're taught to not put anything of the personal into that narrative. But for me, there was no way that I could really fully and truly tell it without doing that. And that's why creative nonfiction kind of gave me an outlet to blend my training as a historian with my ability to tell stories out of my own Black girl voice.
Do you want to talk about, you have two characters in your play,
Okay.
right? The white housewife going to Selma and the FBI agent. They're acted by the same person, right?
Yes. Well, in terms of that, I was just first going to say that with theater provides a way to embody history in a very exciting way, because oftentimes I tell stories that are historical that allow us to re-see things that oftentimes, for example, I've written about Raphael Lemkin, who invented the word genocide, and a person who not a lot of people knew about at the time that I wrote the play. What was exciting about deciding how to write Selma 65 was it was a commission that an actress asked me to write for her, and she told me about Viola Liuzzo, and I wasn't as excited about telling that story as when I decided that the actress could play Viola and Tommy Rowe, because oddly enough, even though they were totally different, they did have a lot of commonalities. And so it was a really interesting way to merge that in terms of my art form.
Well, I think Talita said exactly what is important, is taking back the story. I really think we, people who have stories behind us, and the minorities and people who suffer, because the archives also tell that history is told by the victors normally. History is not told by the ones who lost the wars. It's told by the ones who won the wars, and that is obviously very dangerous. So I think the key words here is taking back our stories and retelling it. And in my case, for example, it started with the Jewish refugees who came through Lisbon, or stayed in Lisbon during the Second World War, and I always asked, and they were thankful, the ones I met, they were all very thankful to the Portuguese government, but I always was surprised by this, because it was a fascist government, not comparable with Hitler, obviously, and not with Mussolini, but a right-wing fascist country. So my question was, how did this happen, you know? And I went and took back the story. I mean, it happened, but a lot of people stayed outside of, were not allowed into the country. And so there was another way, another truth that was lying below the archives, and below what the refugees I met, who were the lucky ones, were saying that they were thanking the country, but they were the lucky ones. And the same happens, speaking of Portugal, with the whole story of the colonialism in Africa, in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea. Portugal is not yet telling the story as it must be told. So taking back the story, I think that's it.
I want to ask a question about, maybe about terror, suffering, violence. There's a tendency in, I think, humans to also try to overcome. And I quoted Paul Celan earlier, who said he was very ambivalent. He said he also he wished he could have forgotten, but he couldn't. But there's a tendency to also want to move on. And then we live in countries where the government says, let's just move on, let's forget this. This is the dominant story. And that appeals to something in people to say, don't dwell on the past. So I want to ask, sort of, this intersects with what Domenico said, which was the PEN organization is committed to freedom of expression around the world for writers to write these stories that go against the dominant narratives. But these dominant narratives appeal to something very human, to also say that's not acknowledged. And Tanisha, you said you had to be honest about where the story intersects with your family. You couldn't just provide a counter story that doesn't acknowledge how this was also violent, traumatic, etc. So I'm interested how the story of resistance has to be told from a place that's not comfortable, that's not just replacing the triumphant story of domination with another one. So the resistance itself is actually very difficult to work on. And I assume all of you have worked really hard to unearth or access something that is not easy, not palatable, not comfortable, not comforting. And this intersects with what Domenico said, that there's, in many countries around the world, a real effort by groups. The Italian case is a very ambiguous one and complicated one for us because PEN is committed to having everybody speak. And you have a fascist publisher who's being thrown out of a book fair. In this country, that signals right away censorship, etc. So how do we deal with voices that actually aren't supposed to be in the room but shouldn't be in the room? So that opens up a whole, I mean, you all know how difficult that is, right? And we all know what's at stake at that moment because we are committed to freedom of expression of all writers. As Domenico says, there are also people who write, let's say, in bad faith. So I'll give that back to you. Yeah, let me get the hand back down
La storia italiana per molti aspetti ha al centro i problemi di cui stiamo discutendo adesso. L'Italia non ha semplicemente avuto tra il 22 e il 43 un governo fascista. L'Italia ha inventato il fascismo. La conseguenza è che questa è una delle terribili e brutali verità che noi abbiamo sottaciuto. Nel momento in cui il fascismo è crollato, l'Italia ha avuto un lungo periodo che va dal 43 al 47, proprio per via della nascita di un nuovo governo fascista, cioè la Repubblica di Salò. Abbiamo avuto un periodo che abbiamo fatto fatica, soltanto in tempi recenti abbiamo chiamato guerra civile. La fine della guerra civile la si è avuta con un'amnistia. La conseguenza è che l'Italia non ha mai fatto realmente i conti con la propria storia fascista. Non li ha fatti perché, caduto il fascismo, è cominciata la guerra fredda e le potenze alleate hanno chiesto all'Italia di mediare con il proprio passato. L'effetto è stato tra i più negativi dal mio punto di vista, perché solo oggi noi abbiamo a disposizione tutti i dati per dire che c'è stata continuità tra il vecchio Stato fascista e il nuovo Stato repubblicano. Questa continuità, gestita all'interno della guerra fredda e all'interno dello scontro con il comunismo, ha comportato una lunga serie di violenze contro i comunisti in Italia. Il periodo comincia nel 1947 con la strage di Portella della Ginestra e non finisce nel giro di pochi anni, ma va avanti tra stragi e tentativi di colpi di Stato anticomunisti fino al 1984, nella sostanza fin sotto la caduta del muro. Questi temi in Italia sono stati affrontati sempre in maniera molto ovattata e solo di recente, c'è un libro uscito credo nel 17, si sono ricostruite le biografie non di grandi personaggi ma di piccoli personaggi che però avevano occupato nel dopoguerra gli stessi posti che avevano in periodo fascista, nei servizi segreti, prefetti, cioè in parole povere all'interno della struttura dello Stato. La guerra fredda in Italia è stata devastante e ha impedito a un grande paese, un paese di grandissima cultura letteraria, artistica, eccetera, eccetera, di crescere politicamente. Crescere politicamente significa non nascondersi niente, ma affrontare il proprio passato, sentirlo ancora presente oggi e chiedersi che cosa bisogna fare per cambiare.
Yes, you have mentioned something that in Italy has been very important. I don't think this is working. Yeah, it's not working. All right, I'll speak as loudly as I can. I don't think this is working either. louder. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so the issue that you just mentioned has been very central in the history of Italy, especially in the period of time going between 1922 and 1943. And there was somebody not somebody, sorry, I apologize. And we need to remember that during those times, we didn't just have a fascist government. We are the ones that invented fascism. And this is a brutal truth that unfortunately has been silenced after that. When fascism, however, the government fell between 1943 and 1947, then we had a new fascist government in the town of Salò. And during that period of time, there was a very difficult period for Italy, which only recently we have been able to define as civil war. And this period of time ended with an amnesty that basically did not allow us to account for all of this fascist history. Because we were at the beginning of the Cold War, and therefore all the powers, big powers, were asking us to try and be reasonable and deal with the past, in a way that would have allowed us to proceed peacefully. However, this created some issues for the future, and only now we are coming to realize that this created an actual continuity between the old fascist government and the following government, because first of all, there were a lot of vendettas against communists, and this started, for instance, with the massacre at Portella della Ginestra in 1947, and went on until 1984, when basically the Berlin Wall then fell, almost at the time when the Berlin Wall fell. But all of this had been muffled, so to speak. People were not really speaking about it. And only recently, a book came out in 1917, I believe, that basically brought up the fact that a lot of the people that had certain positions in government during the fascist period kept those positions after the end of the fascist regime. And they were occupying very important positions, for instance, in the intelligence community, or they were like the prefect of a certain town. So they were the spokespeople for the government, the ones that carried out the government orders. And therefore, this basically prevented Italy from growing politically, because Italy never dealt with the past. And we were not able to ask ourselves what we wanted to do in order to change.
My process for writing this book was very different than the process for my first book, Liberated Threads. And with this book, I began with different images or feelings, smells, tastes that triggered memories. And one of those things was the image of the swimming pool. So if you recall the passage that I read, I say that my aunt was on her way to college, but she had to pass this gym class in order to get her diploma, and she was afraid of swimming. So for me, that was a way to link two historical moments. The period of Jim Crow segregation, where Black kids like her didn't have access to swimming pools to learn how to swim. So this fear comes from a real place. Also, because of the segregation on Black beaches, Black kids often had to swim in the most dangerous parts of the water, and they would die, get caught in the undertow. And so this idea of not being able to swim or not having access to learn how to swim was real for a lot of people in my parents' generation. And so to think about the impact of the pool for my aunt and how this changed the course of her life for me, that was an important story to tell. And so what I do in this book is I use garments as a way to like hold so much of our feelings, our history, our pains, our traumas, our pleasure, our joy, and to use that as a way to like bring history to life in a very hopefully relatable way.
It's an archive, the way Daniel says. That clothes are an archive.
Exactly.
The habits, the traditions, what you carry. I do want to ask you how you write about difficult things and how other people write other books. Sometimes you write really wonderful things, but these are some difficult things. What is that process actually to access something, and what is your hope in reaching this audience, and then we're going to open it up to this audience actually, in presenting them with really terrible things?
I'll just quickly, I was struck when you were talking about censorship, because maybe sometimes people think in the US there's less of it, but I think we are engaged in this kind of fantasy narratives, and I think we create these narratives that people somehow believe are true in this country. And I think for me, what I've been interested in as a US citizen, I'm also a French citizen, but primarily I'm from the United States, is my complicity in oftentimes a historical way in perpetuating horror. And I enter my stories that way. And for me, rather, Brian Stevenson also talks about this. I don't consider it to be a punishment for me or for my country. It's a way for me to engage in hope for change.
What was I going to say? No, a little bit back to Ulrich. I think it's, and obvious to your books, it is important not only to engage with the audience, obviously, and in my case, I'm the process of bringing the archive into the gallery or the archive into the museum is most important, because people usually don't go to archives. Archives are like these sealed places where only specialist researchers with special cards and special credits go usually. So when I bring the archive into the gallery or into the museum and make out of it something that I call art, but it has also a lot to do with Marcel Duchamp, the ready-made, that I transition something from the archive, basically, and with this movement, which is a very simple movement, I give it a new life. I give it a new reading, and I bring it to other audiences who wouldn't see it in any other ways. On the other side, I think books, literature is probably the only way actually to make this transition really work. I think literature is really the only art left that can change the world, so it's more up to you guys. But it is important. I think we all, I don't know about, and I don't want to talk about the United States, I don't live here, but in Europe we're all feeling some despair of what is happening.
Oh, we do too.
I imagine, but I don't want to. I don't want to go into. But this despair, in Central Europe, it comes obviously for what is happening in Hungary and in Italy. In Portugal, the despair is mainly due to what's happening in Brazil, and we have other examples, of course. But in this despair, there must be creativity to renew. And I saw that, not that I was there, but I saw that recently through Brazilian friends and news, what happened in the carnival in Brazil, that the carnival turned into a party of resistance against the government. And people got together because of this despair, because they felt lost. So I think there is, in this despair, a lot of hope, and hope comes through these works, through culture and through art and through literature and everything that is included, and transforms the past into something positive towards the future. I really think so.
I thought I'd open it up. I can only second this. I mean, for me to have this panel here, it's just an honor and a privilege. So we'll have 2 questions. So, Katrina, who wants to take yours first? Yeah.
If you could stand up.
Okay, yes, go ahead. We'll take you in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
I think this question of censorship is very important. So I just want to ask a question after what Domenico Starnone was talking about. This fascist publisher who was expelled from the festival in Italy, and it's a real question. What should we do? You know, is it should there be censorship in that sense, or should we allow anything to be said, but then there is a risk of banalization? So it's just I'm opening the question. We're at a time of greater fascism, but also greater political correctness. Are they connected? Just a question.
Great. So we'll take another question. So go ahead. Sorry.
I have a comment on the question.
Can you stand up? Oh,
You mentioned Paul Celan, and we know about Primo Levi and Jerzy Kaczynski, all who survived the Holocaust, wound up committing suicide, talking about terrible memories. My cousin escaped the Warsaw Ghetto in the early days and came to London, and nobody believed him. He went back to prove it, and after the war he discovered the archives of General Jürgen Struth, which is the general who was responsible for the final solution and made the film The Warsaw Ghetto. I happen to be a documentary filmmaker as well, and a mythical filmmaker. And my question to you is, what is not propaganda?
To me,
could you repeat the question?
What is not?
what is not propaganda? I think everything is propaganda. I think in photography and in film there is always a point of view. And we're not enough aware of that. I think every person who points up a camera has an agenda, and it can be an unconscious agenda. You know, if I like you, I'm going to take a nice picture of you. If I don't like you, I'm going to, put it in a bad light. Or if I want to show a full room, I will point to where everything is full, and so everything is a propaganda. I worked a lot over a period of 10 years. I'm sure you know the Theresienstadt film, the fake documentary made by the Nazis on a fake town. And what still amazes me is that if you see the film without any previous information, the propaganda is still working after so many years. So anything is propaganda, television is propaganda. What we can say is on which side of the propaganda we want to be. Is it the good propaganda or bad propaganda? But I think it always propaganda. And we also need to define ourselves where we stand with fascism. We need to redefine ourselves strongly. And I do think we should not allow all the opinion. Even as a most open and most anti-fascist, I think fascism has to be dealt in an equally aggressive way. We cannot say someone can come here and say something so derogative or racist or anti-Semitic that we say it's a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of opinion. Racism is a crime, and it should be treated as a crime.
Can I just say something? I totally echo that in the sense that, yes, free speech is important, but history, going back to it again, the words never again meant something, and we have to continue to hold on to that.
I just want to point out that some of my favorite Black women thinkers and writers, their words have been banned in this country. I'm thinking about times when the works of Angela Davis weren't allowed to circulate. I'm thinking about Assata Shakur and how she remains on the FBI most wanted list and how they're trying to force Cuba to turn her over, to bring her back to the United States. And I say this in part to say that I count it as an honor and a joy that I get to write books and publish words and tell stories, because so many Black women and girls never get to tell their story. Their voices aren't heard. I think we need more to create more spaces, both formal spaces but also informal spaces where that kind of Black girl-centered storytelling is possible. And so for me, that's one of the aims of my writing. It's not just to publish books and have them circulate well and be read, but it's also to create space for other Black girl storytellers to be able to tell the stories that they want to in a voice that is authentic and unique to them.
Domenico, sorry.
No, io spero brevemente di dire. Volevo velocemente dire, secondo me c'è l'unico modo per scansare la propaganda è che le verità terribili siano raccontate e diffuse in quanto terribili, non devono mai smettere di essere terribili. Nel momento in cui la loro dimensione terribile si addolcisce, automaticamente anche noi scrittori abbiamo perso. La verità terribile deve restare terribile e chi si è macchiato di quelle cose non può essere perdonato in nessun modo e in nessun paese. Noi scrittori europei siamo propensi spesso a dire anche più del dovuto sui nostri amatissimi paesi. Bisogna fare lo stesso anche con l'America, non solo con un'ultima cosa e chiudo. Io mi sono occupato di questo piccolo paesino tra l'inizio del Novecento e la Seconda Guerra Mondiale. Abbiamo raccolto testimonianze, spesso terribili. Poi che cosa ho fatto? Ho pensato, per divulgare ne faccio uno spettacolo teatrale. Poi, in seguito, ne ho fatto un romanzo, ancora per diffondere quelle verità. Oggi non sono più molto sicuro che queste operazioni funzionino, proprio perché nel passaggio attraverso lo spettacolo, attraverso la dimensione letteraria, il rischio è che il terribile si addolcisca, mentre la mia opinione è che ciò che è terribile deve in tutti i modi restare terribile. C'è nei Sommersi e i Salvati, Primo Levi, un brano che io amo moltissimo. Primo Levi va in una scuola, racconta il suo libro, la sua testimonianza, eccetera. Uno dei ragazzini che ha di fronte alza la mano e dice: le voglio dire una cosa, lei doveva uscire dalla baracca, tagliare la gola alla sentinella, spalancare la porta del lager e chiamare tutti i suoi amici e fuggire tutti insieme. E Primo Levi commenta poco questo brano, ma uno sente la tristezza enorme di Primo Levi. Cioè lui capisce che è proprio lo schema di consumo della testimonianza che impedisce alla testimonianza di arrivare realmente al pubblico che ha davanti.
Okay, the only way, I believe the only way to avoid propaganda is actually that of saying those terrible truths and never forget that they are terrible and never allow them to stop being terrible. When you try to sweeten things to make them look more palatable, you lose. If there is somebody who is guilty, you cannot pardon them. You cannot forgive them. And, we always speak lovingly of all of our countries. We love them so much. But we have to tell also what is wrong with them, and the same has to happen about the United States. And there's one last thing I want to point out. As I told you earlier, I dealt with the history of that small town from the beginning of the 20th century up to the time of World War II. And I decided to turn all of that information into a theatrical show, and then I turned it into a novel. But nowadays, I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do. I am afraid that the literary and the theatrical experience actually run the risk of turning whatever is terrible into something more palatable. They sweeten it in a way. And I remember something that Primo Levi says in a book by the title Sommersi. Oh, The Drowned and the Saved in English. Thank you, Stefano. And he recounts an episode of when he goes to an elementary school and he tells the kids about his experience. And then there is this kid that says, "But I really don't understand. Why didn't you go out of the barrack and cut the throat of the sentinel and then call up all your friends and escape? Why didn't you do that?" Well, Primo Levi in his book doesn't really comment much on this episode, but you can feel the sadness that comes from him because he realized that the consumption of this part of history basically has not allowed to the truth, the terrible part of it, to reach the audience.
Just a very simple question. I felt like we heard about the writing and the process from everybody but Domenico. And I just, besides the oral history, I'm just curious about your work.
Ci sono diverse esperienze di scrittura. C'è la scrittura di un romanzo. Nel mio caso mi sforzo di eliminare dal racconto tutto ciò che attende il nocciolo di verità che sento il bisogno di raccontare. Voglio che arrivi al pubblico con forza, con violenza. C'è poi la scrittura saggistica. Nella scrittura saggistica lo sforzo, specie in lingua italiana, è cercare di essere limpio, molto chiaro, di non usare tecniche che sono accattivanti. E poi c'è il teatro, e io amo il teatro, perché il teatro, specialmente nei discorsi di memoria, ha una forza che va al nocciolo di ogni discorso di memoria. Il passato colpisce chi vive oggi solo se chi vive oggi percepisce che le persone che stanno sul palco, che stanno raccontando la loro vicenda, sono in passato vissute in un luogo presente con dolore, con sofferenza. Il teatro dà l'idea della presenza. Vediamo sulla scena l'attore che parla, spruzza saliva, è presente, vive, suda. Il teatro comunica più facilmente la presenza tra noi del passato, spesso nei suoi aspetti più terribili.
Well, writing can be different things, so it depends on what I'm writing. If I'm writing a novel, then I try to eliminate everything that is around the core of truth that I really want to communicate. I want the core of truth to reach the reader in a strong way, almost with violence. If instead I'm writing an essay, then I try to be really clear, really transparent almost. I don't need to captivate the audience. I want to make sure that my message is reaching as clearly as possible the reader. When I'm writing for the theater instead, which is something I really love, then I find that there is a strength in the theater, especially when dealing with memory. In fact, I believe that the past can really hit the target with the audience, only if the audience really perceives the fact that this was dealing with people that were living in the past, and they were in pain, they were suffering, they were real. And the theater can do that. When you see the actor on the stage, that you can feel that he's spitting, saliva is coming out of his mouth, and he is living and he's perspiring, that is true. That is something that the audience can see, and that is something that can communicate that terrible aspect of the past to the audience.
Yes, I have a question. If I understood Mr. Starnone correctly, he said something about telling the truth but not forgiving. But I'm wondering what the other members of the panel think about truth and reconciliation.
The question is about truth. And Domenico said we should not forgive past crimes. And the question is, what about truth and the idea of reconciliation, which has been formalized in some countries, but what about reconciliation or forgiveness? So do you want to take this, and the other panelists maybe, whether it is actually a tension? So that's your question, yeah.
May I start?
Yeah, but be brief.
One.
You have to be brief, Domenico, okay? No, really.
Io sono per la riconciliazione, ma la riconciliazione deve passare attraverso l'ammissione della propria responsabilità. Rifiutare quella responsabilità e dire però siamo riconciliati non va bene, non è possibile.
I am for reconciliation. However, to reach reconciliation, you need to go through the admission of your responsibility. If you negate your responsibility, you cannot reach the reconciliation aspect.
One word, reparations. I believe in this country we have not fully grappled with our history of race and racial terror. It's a history that's constantly being whitewashed, sanitized, and so forth. That's why I'm encouraged by Brian Stevenson's museum and other museums who are seeking to tell the history of racial terror in this country unapologetically with force, and to do so in a way that reaches a public audience so that this history is not just held within the walls of the academy that we know. But if we know, then the next step is what do we do, right? There has to be a formal reckoning with this history, and that's why I am encouraged by the conversations around reparations that are occurring right now, and I'm interested to see what will happen, especially as we approach the 2020 elections.
I was just going to say that sure, in theory, reconciliation, great, but before that, acknowledgement has to happen. And let's just talk about the Native American genocide. We can't reconcile until we've gone through raising awareness and acknowledgement.
Yeah, definitely the word is responsibility. The shadow of what happened in any of these events and tragedy is much bigger than the event itself. So, and we must be responsible for what happened before us, for the generations before. And just to go back for the propaganda really quick, I think what we are seeing in the world right now has also to do that two words that were very important for most of these people here still of that generation are losing their power. And these are words that should be hanging outside instead of Apple and Sony and so forth in every city. And that is Auschwitz and Hiroshima.
And Rwanda.
Later. Yeah.
I'm going to thank the panel and sort of amplify something Tanisha said in response, that we're here to create spaces for voices that haven't been heard, that continue to be repressed. And I would add one thing: the debates about censorship, about one publisher not getting a seat at this podium. This is a book and literary festival, and we did not invite a neo-fascist on this panel. And you could raise a question why, because actually we are committed to keeping open a space. So people who are not committed to opening a space are acting in such bad faith that it is somewhat, we don't have to compromise our own ideals to prove that we have ideals. So I want to thank the panel for opening a space for a difficult discussion, and really mostly want to thank you how humbling it is to be, that you are committed to, as Domenico said, to tell these truths which are very difficult and keep them alive so we can, in this complicated way, move forward. So thank you very much, and thank you very much.